Psychoanalysis, excitement and peace. Excitation is very fundamental to psychoanalysis, both from standpoint of ordinary pleasure and from standpoint of masochism. So from a Freudian perspective, both from life instinct end and death instinct end, from both the ends, except for the inertia of the death instinct, in an essential process terms, excitement is a fundamental process entity. It's almost equivalent in the Freudian context to dynamism. Peace, on the other hand, is not central in psychoanalysis. It is central to many mystical and spiritual traditions, but not central to psychoanalysis. It is understood more or less as absence of a problem. But peace as a positive entity into itself, as a goal, as a health-giving, health-sustaining mild trauma-preventing entity has not been taken up. So we see excitement and peace almost as opposites, but in fact, if we understand peace positively, they no longer remain opposites, because it almost seems as though in process terms, excitement is almost like an expression of the life instinct. It is like life instinct expresses itself in movement, and much of the movement being the pleasure movement, except for a few types of movement which are essentially biological and tasteless. Much of the psychic movement being driven by either pleasure or masochism. It is not just dynamism, but it is an excitement of a particular type. Peace, on the other hand, is seen something very near to inertia. It's almost seen as a psychic equivalence of inertia. It's almost like the peace of the graveyard as it is seen, but it's not seen as the peace of celebration, the peace of health, the peace of dynamism, peace as the ground for dynamism. So to get into this traditional binary, which actually is not a binary, we'll discuss today excitement and peace in the context of psychoanalysis and take a recourse to some insights from Hindu spirituality. So let us look at three entities: pleasure, excitement, and peace, and then see how we can relate the three. Because excitement is largely related to pleasure. So let us look at how psychoanalysis looks at pleasure and excitement by first going into pleasure, then excitement, then peace. So if we look at psychoanalysis, we see three different phases of psychoanalysis. From the standpoint of treating pleasure, phase one was the phase of early Freud, where pleasure was largely confined to the pleasure of survival and the pleasure of senses. So it was essentially sense pleasure and survival pleasure which were at work. The early Freud. Then we had on the sides Adler and some others who brought in the concept of the centrality of power and love, the pleasure of power and the pleasure of love. So this was the phase 2, which was on the side, not in the mainstream. And phase 3 was late Freud, where the word pleasure took a different meaning altogether. And what we used to call pleasure and pain, that binary got dissolved into a different kind of a pleasure. So now we were talking about pleasure, which is also there in masochism, destruction of both self and others, and pleasure of inertia. And this creates a binary of pleasures, because once we go to the pleasure of inertia, that there is a very dense, very compact pleasure of inertia. Ordinarily, we will call it laziness, but at the roots, it's a very dense pleasure of inertia. And if we look now from that standpoint, we can see that there are two categories of pleasure: the pleasure of inertia and the pleasure of excitement. And the pleasure of excitement itself can be divided into these three categories: category of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, which means survival pleasure, sense pleasure, power pleasure, love pleasure, masochistic pleasure, destruction pleasure. All these 6 are different forms of pleasure that involve excitement. General excitement in the first 4 and destructive excitement in the last 2, but excitement nevertheless. So all pleasures apart from the pleasure of inertia, we categorize into excitement pleasure. So now we have inertia pleasure and excitement pleasure. And excitement pleasure divided into 2 parts: the destructive pleasure and the non-destructive pleasure. If we look at it from a Hindu spirituality point of view, Hindu psychology point of view, we have to add one more category called the higher pleasure, which is very different from the classical psychoanalytic approach to the concept of pleasure. In the classical psychoanalytic approach, we have 2 broad categories of pleasure: general pleasure and twisted pleasure. Twisted pleasure is the masochistic and destructive pleasure. This is a term I have coined. It's not in classical psychoanalytic literature. Whereas the other forms of pleasure are very general forms of pleasure, which you and I all would acknowledge are great sources of pleasure for us. So we have general pleasure like the first 4, the twisted pleasures like 5th and 6th, masochistic and destructive pleasure, and twisted pleasure also includes inertia pleasure, and higher pleasure. Higher pleasure are those which are not found in this classification. They are the pleasures involving peace, bliss, enthusiasm, positivity, selflessness, high awareness, bliss, and so on. Now let us look at how Hindu psychology looks at pleasure and excitement. It starts first with the idea of tamasic pleasure, rajasic pleasure, and sattvic pleasure. So tamasic pleasure is the most savage and brute form of pleasure, most coarse form of pleasure. And this involves the pleasure of inertia, sadism, masochism, destruction of self, and destruction of the world. This constitutes what we would otherwise call a twisted pleasure. This is the tamasic pleasure. Then we have rajasic pleasures, which involve sense pleasure, ego pleasure, and emotional pleasure. These three are involved in Rajasic pleasure. Then we have Sattvic pleasure, which is the intellectual, artistic, mystical, and spiritual. And if we look at these last four, you can call them Sattvic pleasures. You can also call them peace pleasures. They are not essentially given to high excitation. It is not the intensity of excitation which actually leads to the pleasure of these types. What it says, the Hindu psychology says, is optimization of excitement and peace. You can't have one and not the other. Optimization of both. Sublimation of pleasure where possible. And a higher proportion of higher pleasures, peace pleasures, in one's basket of pleasures. Let us now, having taken a look at pleasure, now let us look at excitement, ordinary and pathological. Ordinary excitement is what we all know. It's a state of excitement that we can feel. And we can feel a standalone state of excitement, or we can feel, usually as we do, excitement accompanied by pleasure. It may be a general pleasure or a twisted pleasure. So this is the ordinary state of excitement. Sorry, not the twisted pleasure. The ordinary state of excitement includes either standalone excitement or survival pleasure, sense pleasure, ego pleasure, and emotional pleasure. These four pleasures often accompany the state of excitement. So this is what we would constitute as ordinary excitement, either standalone excitement or excitement related to these everyday pleasures. And then we have some exceptional states of excitement, which are not ordinary. You have excitation in manic anger, a secret excitation. You can have catatonic excitement. You can have psychopathic sadism. You can have sadism and masochism without psychopathy. You can have psychotic excitement while the psychotic process is on. There is a full rainbow of pathological excitement, just as there is a rainbow of ordinary excitement. So excitement can be classified into ordinary and pathological, and you have a rainbow under each category, different types of excitations. Let us now look at the relationship or the compare contrast in the two seemingly opposing concepts. They look like two poles of a binary. So let us look at them, excitement and peace. We have seen pleasure and excitement. Let us now look at peace. Usually we see peace on a continuum. So first we see inertia and absolute stillness and absolute cessation of activity in matter, pure inertia. A state of absolute cessation of all movement in matter in its purest form. Then we have deadness. It is like dead matter without any life, without any mind. We see a deadness. So after pure inertia is the state of deadness. You have some material movement. As we find material, we don't find material in the state of pure inertia, but we find material always with its subatomic, submolecular movements. But from a life point of view and mind point of view, it is state appears like deadness. And then we have peace, where we don't see any activity, neither cognitive, nor emotional, nor behavioral, and we see peace. This is how usually we understand the concept of peace, just above inertia and deadness, not in a very positive sense. But from a positive sense, we can understand it also as a power. In spirituality, this is very common. In Sri Aurobindo's writing, it's very common. Peace as a power. Peace as a stable background for dynamism. And here we have to revisit the concepts of life energy versus libido. It's almost like Jung versus Freud. In the Freudian conceptualization, the energy is either libido or aggression, both of them involving some excitation. One is pleasure seeking, second is defending or attacking. Versus Jung, who thought of life energy as pure energy. It's like a bucket of water in which a drop can be put, and whatever drop you put, that color is acquired. And these drops are motivations. These drops are affects. These drops are our ideas which color life energy. If we look at it from that point of view, that if life energy is neutral, then peace also is one entity that can color the life energy and create out of it a stable background. So then we are looking at excitement states versus the peace states. And from a spiritual standpoint, the same peace, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, we move from inertia to deadness to peace. Now, in the spiritual menu of related feelings, the menu goes like this. There is something called stillness, a state of stillness, where there are no thoughts. Everything is held tightly under a stoic still poise. Then there is a state of calm, a more serene state. In stillness, there is some sort of an effort. This is more serene and slightly more spontaneous. And here you have relaxation, but no activity. Then you have peace, where you have relaxation, which provides a stable background, but there is activity. So peace becomes a stable background foundation for dynamic activity. Then we have the state of bliss, the state of pure awareness, a state of nihil, all negating absolute, the nirvanic state, or the state of ecstasy, either felt in a standalone way or felt in an oceanic oneness with existence. And all these spiritual states and associated pleasures are non-excitement pleasures. So if we draw a binary of excitement to peace, we would have to categorize all these pleasures as peace pleasures. All these states as peace states, quite different from the excitement states. From a strictly Freudian point of view, this brings us to a concept, an area we have not actually explored and used adequately. We talk about superego pathology, but we don't talk of superego pleasure and superego strength. Superego strength comes up in logotherapy, and superego pleasure comes up when we talk of these spiritual pleasures or peace pleasures. They are very syntonic with superego. And this is an area which is an area of conflict-free pleasures. Let us go into say something more on the peace pleasures. Hindu spirituality divides it into ordinary pleasures, pathological pleasures, peace pleasures, and goes for optimization of the three, sublimation where possible, and even in the state of enlightenment, which is the goal state of Hindu spirituality, there is a rasa, there is a pleasure. It's a pleasure of bliss. Now, these pleasures are conflict-free pleasures. Conflict is absent internally, conflict is absent externally. Usually in the pursuit of pleasure, we enter into a strife with the external world or with its superego in the internal world. So this is an area of conflict with pleasures. It is pleasure beyond ordinary excitement. There is dynamism. If we equate excitement with dynamism, that's a different equation altogether. But if we keep excitement to mean exactly what it means, then it is pleasure beyond excitement. If we start equating excitement with movement per se, it's a confusion of words and leads to confusion of concepts. There is integral participation in this pleasure of all parts of the psyche, including the superego, which is rare. It leads to composure and cohesion, not to disintegration or disorientation. It actually enhances cohesion, very important from a cohesion standpoint. It enhances homeostasis because usually there is a conflict. The body wants homeostasis and the mind wants excitation. And there is a conflict built into the very hardware of our system. But this is an area where instead of the internal conflict in our system, there is a harmony in our system, a synergetic, mutually strengthening harmony in the system, where the body wants homeostasis, it gets it, and the mind wants pleasure, it gets it, without excitation, without disturbing the homeostasis. In fact, it strengthens it and strengthens the healing part of the body, healing activity of the body, healing activity of the mind, and possibly, some people claim, enhances longevity. In fact, these peace pleasures or these peace states are the goal states of Hindu spirituality. And the ultimate goal state, the highest in that hierarchy of states, hierarchy of goal states, is the state of enlightenment. And this is described as a state of no thought, no ordinary affect, bliss, peace, very high awareness, occasionally with feeling of ecstasy, and in some cases also a feeling of oceanic oneness with existence. Now, how do we enhance the peace states or peace pleasures and minimize the, or rather optimize the excitation pleasures? There are spiritual practices and tools to do it: meditation, visualization, idol therapy, energy healing, yoga. All this and even more, there's a basket full of practices and techniques and tools. I should say basket full of schools, techniques and tools. In some of the other discussions I have discussed in details this aspect of well-being. Practically speaking, how do you start? Very simple. Practice rest, practice relaxation. These two are very important in any healing. If you're undergoing therapy, this is very important to practice on your own as a part of your self-work. If you're practicing spirituality, again, equally important. So from psychotherapeutic point of view, from spiritual point of view, and personal pleasure point of view, personal health point of view, any point of view, rest and relaxation are very important. And this is a good point to start the practice on the path to optimize excitation pleasures and maximize the spiritual pleasures or peace pleasures. Thank you.